What are the economic and financial consequences of the artificial intelligence boom? It's a question that investors and academics and policymakers have been obsessing over for a couple of years. But in the last few months, the debate has moved into a new phase. For most of the past few years, ever since OpenAI first released its ChatGPT chatbot in 2022, the broad consensus was that the rewards of developing AI would go to those who spent the most money. We saw tech giants like Microsoft and Amazon spending tens of billions of dollars building data centers and buying advanced chips, while also throwing money at startups like OpenAI and Anthropic, which are developing the most comprehensive large language models. Meanwhile, those startups were hoovering up vast amounts of data, and Nvidia, which has a near total lock on the global market for the most powerful AI chips, on several occasions overtook Apple to become the biggest company in the world by market value. This consensus faces multiple challenges and questions, though. The most striking one recently came from China, where a startup called DeepSeek revealed a competitive large language model which appears to have been trained for a fraction of the cost of its rivals, and without access to the most sophisticated chips. The news wiped almost $600 billion off Nvidia's market value in a single day in January. Others have cast doubt on some of the more exaggerated claims made about AI's potential, preferring to focus on more narrow, but still very significant benefits that the technology can bring. So this week on The Big View, we're going to take stock of the AI craze. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest questions in business, finance, and economics. I'm your host, Peter Thalarsen. And to help us think through these questions, I've invited Felix Martin onto the show. Felix is an economist, a former fund manager, and the author of a book about the history of money. He's also a regular contributor to Reuters Breaking Views and has written several perceptive columns for us on AI over the past year or two. Felix Martin, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you, Peter. Great to be here.
So, Felix, you've been thinking about generative AI from the perspective of sort of financial markets for a while and writing columns for Breaking Views about this. I mean, there's lots of angles to explore. But I think before we get into the whole question of returns and valuations, let's start with the basic question of how, as an investor, you should think about this technology. And it seems, in your view, it seems like there's basically two camps. Is that right?
Yes, I think that that's something which has emerged over the sort of 2.5 years since this tech really, hit investors' attention. And that's basically since the launch of this ChatGPT large language model and the chatbot which fronts it. So sort of retail-facing application of the underlying technologies. And these two sort of camps which I think have emerged are what I've called the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. This is, reference to the 17th century Civil War in England. And Cavaliers, famously very romantic and sort of big visions about, overarching solutions, monarchy in the Civil War. And they're the ones who, in the case of AI, believe in the possibility of artificial general intelligence, believe that these particular innovations which have happened over the last few years, are the key to producing artificial general intelligence, that is, thinking machines that can do more or less anything that we can do, and in fact can be much better than human beings in all these cognitive capacities, on the one hand. And then the Roundheads, sort of more prosaic, not into such big visions, much more practical people, as they were during the English Civil War. These are the ones who don't underestimate in any way the technical advances in terms of new algorithms and more compute and data and so on, but think this is really about applying all this to specific problems in science, in commerce, in finance, wherever it might be. And that's how this technology is going to generate value. So it's two different visions, really, about where this technology is going to generate results and is going to add economic and financial value.
Okay, so let's just do a quick detour into English history, just for those of us who are a bit rusty on all of this stuff. So the Cavaliers were supporting the king, and the Roundheads were sort of in favour of a sort of parliamentary system. And we should probably also just spoiler alert, let people know that the Roundheads won, right?
They did, and let's face it. I mean, this analogy is mainly, in my case, based on the famous satirical history, much loved by English school children, 1066 and all that. It's a comic history of Britain. And in that history, the Cavaliers, the royalists, they are called wrong but romantic. They're wrong because they lost, obviously, as you point out, but they're much more romantic. Whereas the Roundheads were right but revolting. In other words, it's sort of a bit more boring, but, in the end, they turned out to be right. And of course, I'm betraying my sort of sympathies, or at least my provocation in writing about this stuff, because I think it's much easier to see how the AI Roundheads, people that believe in particular applications of this technology in particular areas, can easily be right about, some revolutionary applications. In fact, there have already been some revolutionary applications. And it's much more tenuous, difficult, but it's pretty romantic to think that this might all lead to some truly revolutionary artificial general intelligence.
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this the other day, a former colleague actually, who basically described it as on the one side you've got people who believe AI is basically like a magic lamp that you rub, and a genie will appear that will grant you wishes. And on the other side, you've got people who basically just think of this as software. But I like your description better. And we know which side you would have been on in the 17th century, I guess. So let's just think about how this sort of how this has manifested itself then. So you said there's been some revolutionary applications already. So talk a bit about those and how that fits into this sort of framework that you're using.
Yes. I mean, maybe we could just take a quick step back, Peter, to say to summarize what I think we're talking about when we talk about, the revolution itself, because it's really the convergence of three much longer running changes. And these are in these three areas. One is in the area of data. We live in a world now which for the last 20 or 30 years has increasingly been one of big data. Because the world is more and more digitized, there are just larger and larger and larger digital machine-readable data sets. That's a crucial component to this whole thing. The second part of it is you need the statistical techniques or the programs or the algorithms with which to extract the signal from the noise from these big data sets. And that's the whole revolution in deep learning, this particular technique which underlies a lot of these latest kind of models and so on. And then you need the computing power with which to apply those algorithms to that data. And that's got a few different components. One of that is the actual hardware, the chips, which process all of these, the algorithms and so on. And another thing which has become, some people's agenda is the power, the electricity that you need to actually power the chips sitting in the data centers to do that. So there's that whole part of it. But it's these three things, trends in big data, in algorithms, and in computing power, that have come together at this particular point in time, and they've produced, this current excitement and this current revolution. But to come to your question in particular, what are these actual examples of what has been done with this? Everybody's aware of these, what I call these retail-facing applications, and that's principally these chatbots behind which sit these so-called large language models, in which the data I was just talking about is enormous quantities of text trawled and copied off the internet, controversial topic in itself, of course, which has enabled these algorithms to be able to respond in very, very realistic prose to questions that you pose and so on. But it's extremely general, and that's this whole idea about general intelligence. Is this going to generate general intelligence out of all that? But the more specific applications, the much better examples there are. I mean, the best example of all, I've used it over and over again because it's a really earth-shattering example, is this application made by the London-based firm DeepMind, acquired by Google a few years ago. So it's now Google DeepMind, Sedemis Hassabis and his collaborators. And they, of course, have literally won a Nobel Prize as of late last year for this particular application. And what they've done is they've taken the same type of deep learning algorithms, applied them to a much smaller database, a data set of about 170,000 proteins. And they've used it to solve what was a very long-standing, half-century-long problem in molecular biology. And this is to try to predict what structure proteins take only from the underlying amino acids. And so they trained this model on lots of existing examples, and they have come up with a predictive mechanism which was much more accurate than anything that had been done previously. And crucially, this did not require a lot of computing power. It was trained on the equivalent of fewer than 200 GPUs, these famous chips, NVIDIA produce them and so on. But fewer than 200. So we're not talking about these tens of thousands of chips in these huge data farms that the people are investing in at the moment and are required for those very large models trying to crunch all the data off the internet. Much smaller scale, but of course a much smaller but more narrowly targeted and tailored and curated data set. And the result, an absolutely revolutionary advance which won a Nobel Prize. That's the sort of roundhead way of thinking.
Yeah, which is already. I was at an event in January with Demis Hassabis, who was the founder of DeepMind, and he was talking about how, I think he said they thought they would have drugs going into medical trials this year already, based on the discoveries from AlphaFold, which take a very, very tangible benefits from that whole development. So we sort of got these sort of two divides now, because on the other side, obviously, what has manifested itself, and this is partly through companies like OpenAI, the inventor of ChatGPT, and others, Microsoft and Amazon and others are also supporting sort of AI startups, is these vast investments, right? I mean, I think we now know that the big tech companies are collectively planning to spend $300 billion this year on investments in data centers, chips, energy to power those data centers. They're restarting defunct nuclear power stations to generate the electricity to power the data centers. And the sort of the idea behind that seems to be the more computing power and the more data that you throw at this problem, the better you will be.
Yeah.
Is that a fair way to summarize it?
Well, I think so. I mean, I think we've got to remember it's always easy for us analysts to sit on the sidelines and criticize and be all smart about this. But of course, these companies and these researchers, they are at the cutting edge of something which is totally new. And we don't know, indeed, what the capacity of these new techniques are. People have theories, but we don't know. And therefore, when they're competing with one another, of course, there's a natural incentive simply to throw more and more money at this to try and see what comes out of it. And there's no doubt that that's what's going on. The second thing which is important to say is, of course, I have to admit that there is no clean distinction between Cavaliers and Roundheads, between individual companies. The truth is that all of these big companies, have both of these groups of people in them, if you like. I tried to make a case in the piece that I wrote recently that, maybe there's evidence that sort of one of them, Google DeepMind, appears to be running more with the roundhead idea than some of the others. But the reality is, of course, they're all trying to innovate as much as possible, as fast as possible on all the algorithms. They're all trying to get as much data as they can, and probably they're all trying to, go for specialist curated data sets as well if they can. So they're trying to do all these things all at the same time, and that's one reason why they need to make as many investments as possible. I think what you're getting at, which is an important thing for investors to think about in the economics of this, is there is obviously an extent to which, if you've got a specific objective, what you're trying to do, you're trying to predict some particular thing, whether it's in finance or in commerce or in science, like the example we just gave of protein folding. In that case, these three inputs of data and algorithms and compute are in some sense substitutes, economically speaking. So the better your data, the less investment in compute you need. The better your algorithms, the less investment in chips and electricity you need. So thinking from an economic perspective, that's important if you've got a specific objective, if you've got the real roundhead view. Now, that's not really true if you're a Cavalier, because nobody knows how to get to this goal of artificial general intelligence. And, the great lesson that everyone has taken away from the revolution of the last 2.5 years is that simply chucking more data and more computing power and better algorithms produces results that nobody thought was possible. No one dreamt that you could sit in front of a chatbot and do the kinds of things you can do today, even if it's not AGI yet. And so for that reason, it's more like they're complements rather than substitutes for the Cavaliers. In other words, you want to chuck more and more, because the more you've got of any single one of those three inputs, the more likely you are to get wherever you're going. Now, the harder-headed investors out there might think, well, I've heard that kind of story before. I've got no idea where I'm going, but I tell you what, I'm going to spend more and more and more on all the inputs, and just trust me, we'll get there. And anyway, I'll get there faster than the next. So I'm not sure how it stands up as an investment thesis compared to. It's much easier to see how the investment thesis for the Roundhead model of the use of AI works, because you've got an idea of where you're going, and you're trying to economize between the three kinds of inputs that you got.
Yeah. But so then, so it's kind of what you're describing really is sort of something of an arms race. But then, of course, into this whole arms race stepped a Chinese startup called DeepSeek, which in January then released this model, which basically seems to do pretty much what some of these other very expensive, very sophisticated models will do, but was done was basically created without the thousands of super advanced NVIDIA graphics processors that the others have used. And so that's rather throwing the cat amongst the pigeons, hasn't it, in terms of the assumptions that people were making about what was necessary in terms of investments to do the types of things that we think AI should do.
Yes, I think. Yeah, of course, it was a big shock. There are questions out there about, how realistic is the claim that it only cost $6 million? Was it actually sort of built on the shoulders of giants? Did it distill stuff from open source models, which actually would cost much more to train and so on? So maybe the actual sort of sunk capex cost was much higher and so on and so forth. But it was obviously a big shock, and it did, as far as us non-technical people can understand it, demonstrate that there are other algorithmic advances that can be made, which can do things much more cheaply. I think the useful thing it's done is really, again, to come back to this framework of these three inputs. It's really concentrated people's minds on the other two inputs apart from compute. It raised a big question about, what was the need for capex on compute? Exactly how much of that capex do you need to do, and how much of it will pay? Because we can come back to it. There's another crucial consideration about this compute element, which is the very rapid depreciation of a lot of the hardware. And that's to do with Moore's law and the fact that, these things improve so rapidly over time. So, the depreciation is really the key thing. You're spending a lot of money on this, and it can be obsolete within 18 months. But what the DeepSeek thing did was it concentrated people's minds on, first of all, what about spending on algorithms? How do you, do we know enough about the economics of improving the algorithms? How do you do that, and how much does it cost? Because obviously it can have a big impact. And it also, I think, has concentrated people's minds a bit on something I also wrote a column about, which I think is really important, which is the data aspect of it. We mentioned it a bit earlier in terms of, how little data was needed actually, as long as it's the right kind of data to produce that Nobel Prize winning advance that Google DeepMind did. And so that's another big question about that out there. It really threw people's minds onto the data. What kind of data is needed? How can you get this data? And what are the economics of getting that data?
So just sort of expand on that a little bit. I mean, you mentioned earlier, obviously, the sort of some of the controversy around how some of these large language models were trained. Basically, it seems they just sucked up a vast amount of information from the internet, some of it from websites with proprietary information from, I don't know, large news organizations, for example. And then there's been sort of subsequent lawsuits and discussions and negotiations, and in some cases payments for that. But if the way you're talking about this, I mean, how should we think about where the value is in data?
Yeah.
Because there is a little bit of a sense of, like, as you said, where if you believe that actually all you just need to do is just throw more and more data at this, then it actually becomes a question of just sucking up as much as possible. And in some cases, even some people in the sort of AI world talk about synthetic data, where you get AI models to generate data, which can then be fed back into the models to make them even better.
Yeah.
But it seems what you're saying, if you take the sort of the roundhead approach, then you're thinking about it differently, right? You're looking for more specific data sets, but which then are more valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a truly fascinating question. I'm sure there are people out there beavering away on this, but if there aren't, they really need to be, because clearly the market for data to train AI models is hopelessly infantile compared, for example, to the market for the hardware for compute. The market for the hardware for compute, is open and free for everyone to see. It's why, NVIDIA makes the chips, and NVIDIA's, was at one point, got to be the biggest company in the world, and it's, and so on and so forth. So we all understand, everyone understands that market, and it's out there, and it's being traded, and there are competitor chips, and so on and so forth. You compare that to the market for data to train these things. There was a story I noticed, recently about how it was written by an author. I'm an author myself. I've got a lot of sympathy for this, who'd been contacted by their publisher, and the publisher had said, listen, Microsoft, I think it was, is going around offering for a flat rate of $5,000 to buy the license to the digital version of your book, just to train their model on. It won't be sold on website or anything like that. It's just to train their model. And of course, for a lot of authors, flat, free, no cost, $5,000, attractive offer. What I found interesting as an economist about that is the complete lack of differentiation and the lack of any kind of market. This is a monopolistic, a big company turning up and doing this. Very odd. Where are the brokers in this? Where is the market structure? Why are there no auctions going on for this kind of data and so on? There's a whole sort of business, to be created, an industry to be created of seeking out valuable data sets, and then on the other side, of course, selling them or renting them or whatever it is to the training institutions. I was reminded, Peter, of this. I was reminded of this story from years ago in a completely different sector. There's a big problem with antimicrobial resistance. How traditional antibiotics, are beginning not to work. And there's apparently an completely alternative method of trying to deal with bacteria, which is bacteriophages, a different kind of organism. And but no one has worked on bacteriophages for a very, very long time, in the West at least. And so not much was known about them. And then people were scrambling around trying to think, well, we need to know more about these things. And then it turned out that there's an enormous database of them held in an institute in Tbilisi, because in the early days of the Soviet Union, they hadn't been able to get hold of antibiotics, and therefore they had devoted a lot of time and energy and funding to researching this stuff. And the primary database of bacteriophages exists in Tbilisi, at this institution. You can imagine in the sort of, early 90s, they had no money at all. And I mean, this kind of gold mine of data, in that case, it was, bacteriophages but that is going to be out there all over the place. We don't know exactly what kinds of data are useful for training these kinds of models for particular problems. And the only way to solve that is to get markets working, but they don't exist at the moment, I don't believe.
I just wanted to tackle a couple of other things that you've sort of thought about and written about. The first is the productivity question. So, the sort of the promises that are made for AI generally are that this will drive an increase in productivity across the economy. It will allow people to do things more efficiently, make people more productive, and this will then boost economic growth and so forth. I mean, you quoted some numbers in a recent column from the economist Darren Osumoglu, another Nobel laureate. We just keep talking about Nobel laureates on this program.
Yeah.
Calling into question about, or at least trying to put some sort of slightly more skeptical numbers around the idea of a productivity boost. But going back to your sort of Roundheads and Cavaliers sort of analogy, like, how should we think about what the direction of AI does to what we can expect in terms of productivity?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, yeah. So on the Roundhead view, you can see very easily how much of an important improver of productivity and actually potentially producer of results which simply couldn't be produced without this new kind of technology. I think that's quite easy to see. It's been demonstrated. Like I said, it's even won a Nobel Prize. So we don't ask any questions about that. I'm slightly more concerned about the types of commercial uses of the Cavalier vision of AI. And why I say that is, I mean, if you read about the kinds of things which are advertised as being the commercial uses, it's sort of AI agents, for example. So this is, setting up an agent which can go and do things for you, the consumer, or for a company trying to sell things to you. So it might be for you, trying to go out and book your holiday most cheaply that you can. Or it might be going and searching on Amazon or all the shopping sites out there for some product that you're looking for. The issue there, of course, is that agents are going to be available to everybody. They're going to be available to the buyer and to the seller, and they're going to be available to all kinds of different buyers. If you're on a financial market where you're competing with lots of different buyers. And so it's kind of easy to see how you might end up in a zero-sum game where you're just spending more and more and more on developing new agents to be cleverer and cleverer, to try and find the gaps, to try and find the way to try and optimize the search engine and so on and so forth. But you're going to be facing, of course, other economic agents who are doing exactly the same thing to you. And so you're just building up deadweight costs, investment in this kind of technology, and it's not actually generating any positive sum gain. I think I mentioned in that piece that people have sometimes pointed out that you can make the same argument about marketing and advertising costs in general. There are some famous examples of that, happening in sort of duopolies where they compete with one another enormously, spend more and more money on marketing, and at the end of the whole thing, no one's actually generated any more sales than they had to begin with. So I think that's conceptually is potentially a bit of a problem with the sort of Cavalier view of AI.
But is there not? I mean, just going back to sort of the DeepSeek example. I mean, one thing that people talk about, economists and people who talk about technology talk about is this idea of diffusion, right? So how quickly does a technology get adopted and spread, and that then determines a new technology, and that determines how what kind of productivity benefits you get. And if it's possible to build a sort of something as good as ChatGPT with all the caveats that you mentioned about how much it really costs. But if we just assume for a moment that actually the barriers to entry are lower, then don't you necessarily get you get a faster diffusion and therefore more general benefits?
Yes, I can. I mean, I can absolutely see. I should emphasize, I myself am an eager adopter and regular user of many of these AI chatbot tools. I have to say that my favorite one at the moment, for example, is Perplexity.ai, which is its niche is to be a sort of different and better, they say, version of Google. So it's really about search, but it gives you, detailed references and so on. I find it extremely useful. I find it more useful than Google. I find it as useful for some, tasks as more traditional sort of academic search engines and so on. I've no doubt it's increased my productivity. Of course, I use it for free at the moment. And the big question is, how much would I be prepared to pay for it, if anything? Not quite sure about that at the moment, what the incremental actual value is. And I don't know how much, it costs to produce. These are the crucial economic questions in this. So I totally take your point, that, the economics are crucial. If these things don't cost much to produce, if that's actually true, then, they could be economical, because, even if I don't have a high willingness to pay myself, the whole thing can work. And there's no doubt that it, is economically useful. It improves the productivity. The great concern is precisely that these things cost quite a lot to produce and are not, in fact, improving productivity very much for whatever reason, whether it's because of the adversarial scenario I was talking about, or whether it's just because they're not generating sufficient value to make up for the costs.
Yeah. So that then brings us, and maybe this is a good place to sort of finish up, brings us to the sort of the kind of investment perspective. So we've seen these vast investments. We've seen huge increases in the valuations, particularly of companies like Nvidia, which is supplying the chips because its revenues have gone through the roof, but also companies like Microsoft and Alphabet, owner of Google, and so forth, have also generally had an uplift from people expecting that there's going to be a kind of a decent return on this investment at some point in the future. And I guess I wonder how you sort of think about the belief that some people believe that what this is basically a bubble that will burst at some point.
Yeah, I think as in, the fact of there having been a dislocating innovation followed by very rapid increase in market prices of securities issued by companies which claim to take advantage of this and so on. This is all the classic Kindleberger description of how bubbles are ignited and grow. So one has to have that in mind. It's all muddied, in my opinion, by the fact that the sort of macro environment, which a lot of people think has been conducive anyway to bubbles for one reason or another, very low interest rates and all that kind of stuff. So one's got to see it in that kind of context. I think that is, as ever with the bubble or not bubble question, pretty difficult to get any kind of analytical hand on. So I trust our investor listeners will just use their guts. Best way to spot a bubble. But there is another part of it though, which is in these when you have a new technology like this, it is always necessarily very difficult to know where in the sort of supply chain the economic value will ultimately reside. So let's assume that bubble or no bubble, there is a whole load of new economic value here in this innovation. There is this big question about where it is, and that's something which the market has clearly been grappling with. You mentioned Nvidia. They are a supplier of hardware. They're the classic, the maker of the shovels in the San Francisco gold boom. So it doesn't matter whether the gold boom is real or not. They're still going to sell a lot of shovels. So that's kind of a safe bet, I think, that people have taken. There's a lot of contracted, sales there, and they're latching onto that. But I mean, a less certain thing, for example, would be electricity demand. We mentioned it earlier. There was a bit of a run up, for example, in utilities and so on, off the back of the idea that 300 billion need to build lots of data centers and so on. Surely someone's going to need to supply the electricity. That's much, much trickier. Electricity markets are funny things, regulated business. The price of electricity is not really often market determined. No one knows the capital requirements of these things. The generation technologies for electricity are changing very rapidly. The whole grid is changing all over the world very rapidly. How do these things interact? Very, very complicated, less easy to spot. it could be that that's where quite a bit of the value does end up, or it could be that none of the value ends up there. Even if this does turn out to be a revolutionary technology which generates loads of revenues. And then you've got the whole applications side of this. Big question out there. Even if it's true that these LLMs are the great breakthrough, is that actually where revenues are going to be generated, or are they going to be captured by people who make applications that sit on top of those things? Mm-hmm. So that, in a sense, I think those are the parts which you can get an easier analytical handle on, and the things I think it's really worth investors thinking about. Whether the whole thing is just a gigantic bubble or not, that's the problem we grapple with every day, with every market.
Yes, well, we had Professor Andrew Odlyzko from the University of Minnesota. Did a show with him last year. He's a great student of the Victorian railway boom of the 1840s, which still is sort of, kind of in terms of proportion of GDP spent is sort of still one of the biggest bubbles ever. And he made an interesting point about this, which was just, he said, when you look at it, this is basically very deep-pocketed tech companies that are sitting on loads of cash, essentially spending the cash that they have.
Yeah.
And so even if they're wrong and, all of this kind of goes up in smoke, it doesn't necessarily have the sort of the damaging consequences that you would have from a bubble, which was funded by debt, where basically, people borrow loads of money and then don't get repaid, and it has repercussions in the economy.
Yeah.
So
I think exactly. I mean, that's always true. Leverage, creates creates a much worse situation when you have the bursting of the bubble.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And there's not too much sign of all of that, although one never knows where it's hiding.
That's true. Well, and also we don't know where we are in that cycle either.
No.
So, Felix, this was really interesting. Thank you for coming on and giving us the benefit of your views on this. And I'm sure this is something we will return to in the future.
Yeah, it's not going away.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Peter.
That's it for this week's show. This podcast was produced by Oliver Taslich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favourite platform. Don't forget to tune into our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and Reuters.com.